There is something most people are unwilling to confront within themselves, and it is this. Not all sensitivity is born from a place of safety, and not all empathy flows naturally from an open heart. There exists a form of empathy that is forged, not given. An empathy that does not emerge from wholeness, but from sustained immersion in emotional uncertainty. It is the empathy of the one who endured, the one who learned to read the temperature of a room long before they ever felt safe enough to trust it. The one who cultivated perception not as a gift, but as a means of navigating danger. When you observe such a person, you might be inclined to call them compassionate, intuitive, finely attuned to the world. And yet beneath this polished sensitivity lies an origin that is almost never spoken of. Suffering is often the ground from which this depth of awareness takes root. If you have ever found yourself sensing everything in your surroundings with an exhausting precision, picking up shifts in energy before a single word is exchanged, detecting tensions that others refuse to acknowledge, receiving emotional undercurrents like a silent receiver, then you must sit with a difficult question. Did this capacity develop because the world received you warmly, or because the world once felt threatening enough that you had to learn how to sense danger before it reached you? The psyche, you see, is far from naive. It adapts with a quiet and extraordinary intelligence. When a child matures within an environment where emotional consistency is unpredictable, where affection is conditional, unstable, or threaded through with fear, the unconscious begins to sharpen its instruments. It cultivates what might be called hypervigilant attunement. The child becomes fluent in micro-expressions, in tonal shifts, in the weight of unspoken things, in the tension that lives beneath ordinary exchanges. This is not empathy in its most natural form. It is watchfulness wearing the face of empathy. And this distinction carries enormous weight because empathy born from survival carries a concealed price. It is not simply the capacity to feel others. It is the incapacity to stop feeling them. It does not wait for invitation before it enters your awareness. It overwhelms the psyche with information, emotional data that the conscious mind often cannot keep pace with. Over time, this produces a condition of chronic inner saturation. You may recognize this within yourself if you often feel depleted after being with others, without fully understanding the cause. It is not the exchange itself that empties you. It is the unconscious labor of continuously mapping the emotional terrain around you. You are not simply receiving words. You are absorbing entire atmospheres. You are not merely watching people. You are registering their unresolved tensions, their concealed fears, their suppressed conflicts. And here lies the paradox that so few people truly understand about the empath who is shaped by suffering and who retreats into solitude. They do not pull away from the world because they lack care for it. They pull away because they carry too much of it. Their aloneness is not absence of feeling. It is a shield against it. There arrives a moment in such a person's life when the psyche reaches its limit. It recognizes that unceasing emotional exposure is unsustainable. At this juncture, the individual may begin to withdraw, not as a deliberate choice at first, but as an instinctive response. Social spaces begin to feel like weight. Crowds become suffocating. Even intimate relationships may begin to feel burdensome because they require unending emotional engagement. This withdrawal is frequently misread by others. Those around them may see it as coldness, as pride, as detachment. But in truth, it is the psyche attempting to find its balance. It is the unconscious declaring that you cannot continue to take in without protection, or you will cease to exist as yourself. You must hold something important here. Those shaped by suffering who carry this kind of sensitivity and who seek solitude stand at a fragile and precise psychological crossroads. They hold within them rare perceptive gifts, but they also carry a real danger of psychological fragmentation. If they do not learn to regulate their sensitivity through integration, their empathy risks becoming a form of self-erosion. This is precisely why so few emerge from this stage intact. Many either seal themselves off, extinguishing their perception entirely, or remain perpetually flooded, caught in endless cycles of emotional depletion. Only a rare number manage to carry this empathy through to something stable and whole. What determines whether someone survives this passage is not the strength of their empathy alone, but the construction of boundaries within the psyche. The individual must come to understand that awareness does not demand absorption. To perceive does not mean to carry. To comprehend does not mean to merge. And yet this understanding proves extraordinarily difficult for those whose empathy was forged in survival, because their original strategy for staying safe depended precisely on merging with everything around them. As children, they could not risk separation from the emotional field in which they lived. Their security depended upon anticipating the emotional states of others. This survival mechanism becomes deeply woven into the unconscious fabric, and so as adults, they often carry a profound inner conflict. One part of the psyche continues reaching toward attunement with others, while another part urgently reaches toward distance. This creates a tension between closeness and retreat, a constant inward pull that defines much of their interior life. You may know this tension intimately. You long for profound connection, yet when it finally arrives, you feel overtaken by it. You desire intimacy, yet sustained closeness begins to feel like confinement. You wish to offer your care, yet you find yourself exhausted by the weight of others' needs. This is not a defect in who you are. It is the psyche attempting to renegotiate its boundaries after a lifetime of giving everything away. At a deeper symbolic level, those shaped by suffering who carry this heightened sensitivity often embody a very ancient archetypal pattern, the wounded seer. Throughout the mythological record, there exist figures who gained extraordinary vision precisely because they had moved through great pain. They perceive more than others, but their sight separates them. They understand human nature with an unusual clarity, yet they often find themselves standing at the edge of the circle, just outside belonging. This archetype recurs across cultures because it touches a universal psychological truth. Heightened awareness frequently comes at the cost of ordinary belonging. To see too clearly is to recognize the contradictions that others choose not to examine. It is to perceive the unconscious drives hidden within social performances. It is to feel the emotional dissonance living just beneath polished interactions. And this clarity can produce a loneliness that goes very deep. For those who carry this sensitivity and this solitude, the loneliness is not merely social in nature, it is existential. They often feel that their inner reality cannot be fully shared with others because their perceptions are too layered, too subtle, too deeply rooted in psychological textures that most people do not consciously notice. This gives rise to a form of silent isolation, not because they lack relationships, but because they lack resonance. They may be surrounded by others and yet feel unseen at the most essential level. Here, the danger of sinking into excessive withdrawal becomes real. While solitude is genuinely necessary for renewal, prolonged isolation risks severing the relational currents that the psyche requires to remain whole. Human beings need some degree of interpersonal engagement to stay psychologically balanced. Thus, the central challenge for those who carry this wound is not to extinguish their sensitivity, but to transform it. They must learn to draw a distinction between perception and responsibility. They must come to recognize that understanding another person's inner state does not commit them to resolving it. This recognition marks the true beginning of individuation. Individuation, as you must understand, is not the process of becoming less attuned to the world. It is the process of becoming more differentiated within it. It is the capacity to remain aware of others without dissolving into them. For those whose empathy was born from survival, this demands a fundamental shift in identity. They must step out of the unconscious role of emotional guardian, the one who perpetually watches over and steadies others, into a more sovereign psychological position. This movement often feels frightening because it challenges the survival pattern that anchored their early existence. Releasing hypervigilant attunement can feel like removing a form of armor. The unconscious carries the fear that without constant readiness, danger will return. But what the psyche must discover is that adulthood contains forms of safety that childhood did not offer. Boundaries, choice, autonomy. These become the instruments through which sensitivity is preserved without being consumed. Only when this transformation takes hold can empathy forged in survival evolve into something genuinely powerful. It becomes no longer a defensive strategy, but a form of conscious understanding. It enables the individual to see others deeply, without losing themselves in the seeing. And this is precisely why so few emerge from this passage in a truly whole way. It demands not only awareness, but courage. The courage to release survival patterns that once sheltered the psyche, but now limit its becoming. If you find yourself on this path, you must understand that your withdrawal is not evidence of failure. It is a phase of psychological reconstruction. It is the psyche recalibrating its sense of boundary after years of overextension. You are not retreating because you are incapable of closeness. You are retreating because your inner world is undergoing a transformation that cannot be rushed. And this transformation, though it carries real pain, holds within it an extraordinary possibility. The emergence of a self that can feel deeply without being overwhelmed, that can perceive clearly without becoming imprisoned by its own vision, that can move through human experience without losing its center. When this passage is navigated with care, those who carried this wound do not become distant from the world. They become anchored within themselves. They no longer disappear into the emotional disorder around them. They stand within it with clarity, and from that ground they hold a rare capacity, the ability to perceive human nature with both compassion and discernment, without illusion, without self-abandonment, without surrendering their own psychological coherence. This is the threshold where survival gives way to individuation, and very few reach it. As you move closer to this threshold, the moment at which empathy shaped by suffering must transform or collapse, you often encounter a psychological experience that feels almost contradictory. It is as though the same sensitivity that once wove you into the world now begins to set you apart from it. You begin to perceive patterns in human behavior that you can no longer overlook. And with this recognition comes a quiet but substantial shift in how you relate to others. At first, this shift does not feel like growth. It feels like disenchantment. You may find yourself observing interactions that once seemed unremarkable and now sensing the unconscious currents beneath them. The quiet maneuvering for acceptance, the unspoken fears that animate certain behaviors, the unacknowledged tensions that structure social life beneath its surface. What once appeared straightforward now reveals hidden layers. And this awareness can be deeply unsettling. This phase tends to arrive slowly. It does not announce itself as a singular revelation, but accumulates gradually in small recognitions. Moments in which you realize you can no longer participate in emotional exchanges the way you once did. Conversations that once felt meaningful now feel draining, not because you lack interest, but because you sense what is not being said. You detect the distance between the words spoken and what is truly felt. You feel the friction between the face someone presents and the reality they carry inwardly. This heightened perception introduces a profound psychological dilemma. You cannot unlearn what you now see, and this is precisely where the archetypal pattern of the seer becomes most relevant. In ancient storytelling, the seer is portrayed as both graced and burdened, possessing vision while that same vision places them beyond ordinary belonging. They see truths that others refuse to face, and that awareness holds them apart from the common flow of experience. Those who carry empathy shaped by suffering enter an equivalent psychological territory. You begin to recognize that much of human exchange rests on unconscious agreements to preserve certain illusions, to avoid certain confrontations, to maintain social cohesion at the expense of authenticity. But once these unconscious dynamics become visible to you, participating in them becomes increasingly impossible. This creates what might be called the isolation of clarity. It is not loneliness in the ordinary sense of having no one near. It is a deeper form of psychological separation. The feeling of perceiving reality through a lens that others do not seem to share. You may be surrounded by people and still feel inwardly remote because your perception moves at a depth that resists easy communication. This stage is particularly dangerous for those who carry this wound because it can lead to an unconscious withdrawal not only from social life, but from emotional engagement altogether. The psyche, saturated by ceaseless subtle input, may seek to protect itself by narrowing its exposure entirely. You may notice that you begin instinctively avoiding certain environments not through deliberate choice, but because your nervous system anticipates the overload they will bring. Dense crowds, emotionally charged gatherings, or relationships shadowed by unresolved conflict may become genuinely intolerable. At a physiological level, this goes beyond psychological reaction. The body participates in this process as well. Those shaped by early emotional unpredictability often carry a nervous system conditioned for sustained alertness. A heightened baseline sensitivity and autonomic state perpetually tuned to environmental cues. When this system encounters excessive emotional stimuli, it can tip into overwhelm or shut down entirely. You may experience this as abrupt exhaustion, a clouding of thought, emotional numbness, or an urgent and wordless need to disappear from the room. You must understand this not as weakness, but as an adaptive response. The psyche and the body are attempting to regulate a volume of sensory and emotional input that exceeds what is sustainable. Yet, if this withdrawal continues without conscious integration, it risks leading to something far more serious: a disconnection from life itself. This is the point at which empathy shaped by survival may shift into emotional detachment. The individual, worn down by years of hypervigilant attunement, may unconsciously shut down their perception entirely. They may lose not only the capacity to absorb others' emotional realities, but also the capacity to feel richly within themselves. This phase can be deceptive because it often appears as composure. Those around them may read this shift as maturity, as stillness, as emotional solidity. They may observe that you have become more measured, less reactive, more self-contained. But inwardly, the experience may carry an entirely different quality: a quiet hollowness, a dimming of emotional vitality, a sense that the world has grown muted and unreachable. This is not true individuation. It is protective withdrawal. True individuation does not call for the elimination of empathy. It calls for the differentiation of empathy from identity. Those shaped by this kind of sensitivity must come to understand that perception does not need to constitute the foundation of their being. They are not their attunement. They are not their ability to sense emotional nuance. These are capacities of the psyche, not the essence of the self. At this juncture, a decisive transformation must take place: the shift from unconscious empathy to conscious empathy. Unconscious empathy operates on its own terms. It absorbs without limits. It fuses with the surrounding emotional field. It responds instinctively, often bypassing the conscious mind entirely. Conscious empathy, by contrast, involves the exercise of will. It allows you to perceive others without entering their emotional interior. It makes understanding possible without identification. It creates a psychological space between the act of observing and the act of absorbing. This shift is extraordinarily difficult for those whose empathy was born from survival because it requires dismantling a strategy that once kept them safe. The unconscious resists this movement because it has long equated hypervigilant attunement with protection. But what the psyche must learn is that the conditions which once made that constant readiness necessary no longer hold in the same way. As an adult, you have agency. You can shape your environment. You can establish limits. You can move away from harmful dynamics. You are no longer dependent on others for survival in the way you once were. The unconscious, however, does not easily revise its map of reality. It continues to move according to patterns laid down in early life. This is why those shaped by this wound so often feel caught between past and present. Their current world may be genuinely safe, yet their inner responses remain calibrated by earlier experiences of instability. To move beyond this stage, a process of conscious reorientation becomes essential. You must begin to teach the psyche that awareness does not demand perpetual readiness for threat. One of the most powerful pathways through which this occurs is the cultivation of inner limits, not physical ones, but psychological ones. These internal boundaries allow you to remain aware of others without letting their emotional states penetrate your core. You begin to recognize that you can witness someone's pain without lifting it onto your own shoulders. You can grasp someone's fear without taking it into your body. You can observe someone's unraveling without losing your own footing. This realization does not erode your compassion, it refines it. Compassion that arises from unconscious fusion leads to exhaustion. Compassion that arises from a grounded sense of self leads to endurance. This distinction marks a profound turning point in the life of the one who carries this wound. It is the moment when survival begins to yield to autonomy. Yet this transition is frequently accompanied by another form of pain. The recognition that many relationships were constructed upon your unconscious function as an emotional stabilizer. When you stop absorbing, when you stop steadying others as a reflex, when you begin to hold limits, certain relationships begin to shift dramatically. People who once felt at ease in your presence may respond with confusion, resistance, or even resentment. They may speak of you as having changed, as having grown cold, as having become inaccessible. They may work to restore the old arrangement in which you served as their invisible anchor. This response is not a measure of your failure. It is a measure of the equilibrium that previously existed between you. When one part of a system changes, the whole system must find a new form. For those carrying this wound, this stage can feel profoundly lonely. You may find yourself at a psychological distance from people you once felt woven to. You may grieve not only changed relationships, but a former version of yourself. You are no longer the one who takes in everything. You are no longer defined primarily by what you absorb for others. You are becoming something new and unfamiliar, an individual whose center lives within them. And this transformation, necessary as it is, often feels like crossing a wide and silent interior wilderness. It is here, within this psychological terrain, that the next phase of individuation begins, the phase in which empathy born from survival is not merely managed, but woven into a stable and enduring sense of self. And it is within this integration that solitude ceases to define the person and something far more profound begins to take shape. An inner sovereignty that allows for genuine connection without surrender, perception without depletion, and care without self-erasure. This is the path that only a very small number fully complete. And it is why, psychologically speaking, so few truly survive this transformation in its highest form. As you move further into this transformation, you begin to enter a psychological space that is both deeply unsettling and strangely sacred. A region in which the former identity no longer fully contains you, yet the new one has not yet fully taken shape. This is the territory the alchemists once named the Nigredo, the dark phase of inner dissolution, in which structures that once provided orientation must fall apart so that something more genuine can emerge. For those who carry this wound and have retreated into necessary solitude, this stage often arrives as a quiet falling away of familiar interior markers. The roles that once gave your existence its sense of worth begin to lose their pull. The impulse to mend, to soothe, to anticipate, to carry others begins to quiet within you. The unconscious arrangements that bound you to these functions begin to dissolve. And with their dissolving comes an emptiness that feels unfamiliar and difficult to name. This emptiness can provoke real fear because it does not resemble anything you have known before. It is neither the flooded emotional intensity of hypervigilant attunement nor the muted numbness of protective withdrawal. It is something quieter, more ambiguous, almost like the psyche drawing a long and suspended breath. Many people at this juncture mistake this state for loss of identity, loss of connection, loss of meaning. They may ask themselves with a low and creeping unease, who am I if I am no longer the one who holds everyone together? Who am I when I am no longer defined by my ability to feel everything around me? You must recognize that this question marks a significant turning point. It signals that the psyche is beginning to move away from a relational identity, one defined primarily through interaction with others, and toward an intrinsic identity rooted in the depths of the self. This distinction is of real importance. A relational identity depends upon the external emotional field for its sense of direction. It finds its meaning in being needed, in being attuned, in being essential to the emotional balance of others. An intrinsic identity, however, rises from a deeper internal center. It does not require external validation or functional roles in order to hold itself together. For those shaped by this wound, the movement from relational identity to intrinsic identity frequently feels like stepping into unmapped terrain. It asks them to release a subtle, yet deeply embedded psychological attachment. The attachment to being necessary. You see, for many who carry empathy born from suffering, early life taught them that their value was conditional upon their ability to stabilize what was unstable around them. They learned, often without knowing it consciously, that their sensitivity was the reason they were tolerated, welcomed, or loved. Their sense of worth became inseparable from their function. When this function begins to dissolve, the unconscious can experience it as a threat to the very foundations of existence. The psyche may produce anxiety, restlessness, or a creeping sense of purposelessness, as though something indispensable is quietly slipping away. But what is actually occurring is not loss. It is reorganization. The psyche is redistributing its energy. The emotional resources that were once channeled outward in continuous attunement begin to move inward. This redirection is not a turning away from life. It is a turning of attention toward the inner world. At this stage, many begin to experience an intensified relationship with their own unconscious. Dreams may grow more vivid and layered. Symbolic images may arise without summons. Inward reflections may deepen in richness and complexity. It is as though the psyche no longer consumed by constant external monitoring, begins to surface its concealed contents. This encounter with the inner world can be both illuminating and disorienting. For what may be the first time, you begin to notice aspects of yourself that were previously eclipsed by your focus on others. Suppressed anger, grief that was never allowed a voice, desires that were left unacknowledged, impulses that seem to contradict the compassionate identity you have long carried. This is the encounter with the shadow. For those whose empathy arose from early suffering, the shadow often holds qualities they were never permitted to inhabit: assertiveness, self-interest, resentment, even anger. Because their survival depended upon keeping the emotional atmosphere stable, these aspects were pushed below the threshold of consciousness. They became incompatible with the identity of the one who stabilizes and soothes. But as individuation deepens, the shadow inevitably rises. It demands that it be seen, not to destroy empathy, but to restore what was missing. Because genuine empathy cannot survive the complete suppression of one's own needs and emotional reality. This confrontation with the shadow can feel deeply disquieting. Emotions may surface that seem foreign, even troubling. Anger may arise toward those you once gave everything to support. You may see patterns of self-abandonment in your history that now feel impossible to continue. It is essential that you do not interpret these revelations as signs that something has gone wrong within you. They are signs that something is being restored. The psyche is working to return to wholeness, bringing into awareness what was excluded in order to sustain a role that could not hold much longer. These emerging aspects do not negate your empathy. They protect it from becoming the instrument of your own dissolution. Without the integration of the shadow, empathy remains unfinished. It remains open to being exploited, to progressive exhaustion, to a slow erosion of identity. When the shadow is finally met and integrated, a deep transformation takes hold. Empathy becomes grounded in inner strength rather than in exposure. It becomes discerning rather than indiscriminate. It develops the capacity to distinguish authentic need from unconscious manipulation. This shift brings a noticeable change in your relational life. You may find that you no longer respond automatically to the emotional signals of others. You may pause before extending yourself. You may discover a new capacity to say no without the familiar weight of guilt pressing in behind it. Those around you may be unsettled by this change. They may perceive you as less reachable, less yielding, less predictable than before. Some may work to cast this change in a negative light because it disrupts the unconscious arrangements that once structured your relationships. But within you, something profoundly new may be taking root. A kind of stability that does not depend on constant emotional engagement with others. This stability arises from what might be called the emergence of an inner center, a psychological point of reference that holds steady regardless of what moves in the world outside. The experience of being genuinely anchored within yourself. For those who carry this wound, this anchoring represents a decisive shift. You are no longer oriented primarily toward the emotional landscape outside of you. You are oriented toward your own inner axis. From this position, your perception undergoes a quiet but significant change. You may still register the emotional currents around you, but they no longer move through you in the same way. They arrive as information rather than as experience you are compelled to absorb. This creates an extraordinary capacity. The ability to witness without merging, to observe conflict without being undone by it, to stand near suffering without losing your own equilibrium, to offer care without offering yourself up entirely. This is the stage at which empathy formed in survival becomes conscious understanding, and yet this transformation carries with it another form of aloneness, one that is less painful but equally real. As your inner center deepens, you may notice that your resonance with many people gradually decreases, not because you have stopped caring, but because your psychological orientation has fundamentally shifted. You are no longer drawn toward emotional turbulence. You are no longer compelled to enter unconscious relational patterns simply because they are familiar. The result is often a narrowing of your social world. You may find that only certain people feel genuinely compatible now. Those who carry a similar level of self-awareness, those who honor psychological limits, those who are capable of authentic connection rather than unconscious entanglement. This selective resonance is not a sign of retreat. It is a sign of individuation. Those who have carried this wound, who have moved through hypervigilant attunement, through disenchantment, through withdrawal, through the encounter with the shadow and toward an inner anchoring, begin to embody a kind of presence that is both deeply perceptive and quietly sovereign. They are no longer defined by their solitude, nor by their sensitivity alone. They have become something more layered, an individual whose empathy arises from consciousness rather than compulsion. This state is rare, not because it is beyond reach, but because the path that leads to it is long and frequently painful. A path through dissolution, confrontation, and reconstruction. It asks that one release the identity of the one who perpetually gives. It asks that one face the shadow without turning away. It asks that one endure the aloneness of inner transformation without grasping for premature relief through external approval. Few are willing to remain with this process long enough to see it through. But those who do emerge not diminished, but profoundly deepened, possessing a perceptive capacity that is no longer a burden, a capacity for connection that no longer destabilizes them, and an inner center that holds steady even amidst the full weight of human experience. And it is from this center that the final stage of this transformation begins to unfold. The stage in which empathy is no longer simply a survival, adaptation, nor a personal trait alone, but becomes an instrument of psychological clarity that can illuminate both one's own inner life and the wider human world without consuming either. This is the threshold that very few reach, and it is here that those who began as survivors cease to be defined by what they endured and begin to inhabit the full sovereignty of the individuated self. When this final threshold begins to open, you may notice that something quiet yet unmistakable has shifted in the way you move through the world. It is not a dramatic change visible to those around you. It is an inner realignment so thorough that it quietly reshapes every encounter, every perception, every movement of the psyche. You no longer experience empathy as something that overtakes you. It is no longer an uncontrollable tide of emotional information rising up through your awareness. It becomes instead something you hold, something you can orient consciously, something that moves under the quiet authority of your own will. This distinction marks the completion of a long inner journey. This stage represents the emergence of what we might call psychological sovereignty. You have moved from unconscious attunement to conscious perception, from survival-driven vigilance to self-directed awareness, from emotional merger to differentiated presence. And this sovereignty holds a quality that is difficult to convey to those who have not yet known it. It is not coldness, it is not indifference, it is not the absence of feeling. It is a state in which you can remain fully present to the emotional reality of those around you without losing your own ground. This presence is extraordinarily rare because it requires the simultaneous integration of two psychological capacities that tend to exist in opposition: deep sensitivity and strong inner limits. Most people hold one at the cost of the other. They are either deeply empathic but easily overwhelmed, or strongly defended but emotionally shut away. But the person who has carried this wound and has traversed the full arc of individuation holds both at once. You can feel without dissolving. You can comprehend without absorbing. You can care without relinquishing yourself. This balanced state gives rise to a new quality of relational presence. Others may sense something unusual when they are near you, a calm that is not passive, an attentiveness that does not impose, a steadiness that does not attempt to manage what it meets. People may find themselves speaking truths in your presence that they have never voiced aloud. They may feel genuinely perceived in a way that does not feel intrusive or demanding. They may experience a kind of psychological ease in your company simply because your awareness does not press itself upon them. And yet there is also something unmistakably firm in your presence. You no longer send out the unconscious signals of unlimited availability that once invited others to lean their full weight upon you. There is a clarity in how you hold yourself that communicates, without words, that you cannot be drawn unwittingly into another's disorder. This combination, deep receptivity, held alongside an unwavering inner containment, defines the fully integrated individual who once carried this wound. At this stage, the loneliness that once accompanied your sensitivity undergoes a profound change. It does not vanish entirely, for individuation always carries an element of solitude, but it changes in texture. It becomes no longer the loneliness of one who cannot be reached. It becomes the solitude of one who is complete within themselves. You are no longer alone because understanding has failed to find you. You are alone because you have found a relationship with yourself that no longer depends upon constant external mirroring. This inner companionship provides a stability that was previously absent. It allows you to engage with others from a place of wholeness rather than need. Connection becomes a genuine choice rather than an unconscious strategy for survival. From this position, your relationship with humanity as a whole undergoes a quiet transformation as well. You begin to perceive human behavior with a clarity that holds both compassion and discernment simultaneously. You can recognize the wounds that drive others without excusing the harm those wounds produce. You can understand unconscious patterns without becoming entangled within them. This balanced orientation frequently manifests as a quiet kind of wisdom, the capacity to meet the complexity of life with nuance rather than reaction. You may notice that you are less easily moved by emotional turbulence. Situations that once overwhelmed you now appear as recognizable patterns rather than personal threats. You observe conflict with an almost symbolic awareness, seeing the archetypal currents moving beneath the surface of individual behavior. You may recognize the frightened child concealed within an aggressive adult, the hunger for recognition hidden beneath defensive pride, the dread of abandonment masked by controlling behavior. These perceptions no longer disturb your equilibrium. They deepen your understanding. And this understanding allows you to respond consciously rather than to react automatically. Perhaps the most profound shift at this stage is the change in your relationship to your own history. The suffering that once shaped your empathy no longer defines who you are. It becomes integrated into your psychological story as a source of insight rather than a source of confinement. You may look back on your earlier years, not with bitterness, but with a kind of clear-eyed recognition. You can see how the psyche adapted, how it developed its remarkable perceptive capacities in order to endure conditions that demanded constant alertness. You recognize that the same sensitivity that once exposed you to relentless emotional currents also equipped you to navigate complex psychological terrain with a precision few others possess. And this recognition produces a subtle but real form of inner resolution. You no longer see your past exclusively as the thing that harmed you. You begin to see it as the thing that shaped you, as something that through a long and arduous process of transformation contributed to the particular depth you now carry. This does not mean you romanticize suffering. It means you integrate it. Integration allows you to stand fully in the present without being governed invisibly by the past. The survival patterns that once ran automatically now exist as conscious knowledge. You can draw on them when needed, but they no longer operate you. This liberation marks the genuine completion of individuation in this domain. And from this place, empathy evolves beyond the personal. It becomes a lens through which you can perceive the collective movements of human life. You may begin recognizing patterns not only within intimate relationships, but within broader social structures. The ways in which fear, projection, and unconscious conflict shape the behavior of groups, the formation of cultural narratives, the repetitive arcs of historical events. This expanded awareness marks the final transformation of empathy, born from suffering into conscious understanding. You no longer experience your sensitivity as a private burden. You recognize it as a capacity for perceiving the deeper currents that run beneath the surface of human existence. And yet, even at this stage, a genuine humility tends to emerge. You become aware that perception, however refined, does not confer perfect knowledge. The unconscious remains vast and inexhaustible. The full complexity of human experience remains beyond any final comprehension. And so the fully integrated individual does not position themselves above humanity, but within it. Aware of its contradictions, its wounds, its resilience, its capacity for both destruction and profound renewal. From this position, something quietly remarkable becomes possible. Empathy ceases to be merely responsive or defensive. It becomes generative. It allows you to contribute to the world not by carrying its suffering, but by illuminating its hidden patterns. Your presence itself becomes a stabilizing force, not because you bear others' burdens, but because you embody a psychological coherence that others can sense without being able to name. You become, in essence, a living demonstration of what it means to remain sensitive without being overtaken, aware without being consumed, connected without losing oneself in the process. And this ultimately is why so few fully complete the journey of the one who carries this wound. It is not because the path cannot be walked, it is because it demands enduring a long and often solitary transformation, one that asks for the relinquishing of old identities, for the facing of what was concealed in the psyche, for the toleration of deep uncertainty, and for the patient reconstruction of a new inner foundation. Most turn back before this process reaches its conclusion. But those who persist discover something that no external achievement can provide: a stable center of awareness that remains unshaken regardless of what moves in the world around it. From this center, empathy becomes not a vulnerability, but a quiet form of power. And it is here, finally, that the one who carried this wound ceases to live only as a survivor and begins to inhabit, fully and without apology, the extraordinary depth and complexity of being human.